David Diaz, I'm glad you're joining in. I had a wonderful conversation with you earlier this week. Looking forward to working with you and potentially another book that he has recommended. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay, we are live on YouTube as well.
All right, welcome to the book club hosted by the World Affairs Council of San Antonio. We are in for a special treat this month. We have an award-winning journalist and an author who a lot of people know about and who have read his books, and we'll be talking about one of those books today. And we have a longtime friend of the World Affairs Council, a board member, a board chair, and everything in between. And they will both be introduced here shortly. But I do want to thank everyone for tuning in. We can't do our programming without your support. So if you're interested in our membership opportunities, please visit our website to learn more about that. Or if you want to make a gift that is significant to you, please also learn how you could do that by visiting our website. And of course, our programming, if you want to learn more and stay updated about our programming coming up. We've got a really special one about Iran coming up in a few weeks. So if you submit your email, you will find out who will be on our program next. Without further interruption, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Samantha Scory, whose vision was to create a platform so that authors and really good authors like Alfredo Corchado could share their stories and allow our members and supporters to learn and listen from them. So without further interruption, I want to introduce you to Samantha Scory. Samantha?
Hello, all, and welcome to the World Affairs Council of San Antonio Book Club, featuring Homelands, Four Friends, Two Countries, and the Fate of the Great Mexican-American Migration by Alfredo Corchado, who's here with us today. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, we're so excited to have you here, and we're so thankful and excited to have your support and participation today. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this month's book club, Inigo Arzak. So over the past 15 years, Inigo has been expertly conducting international business for the private and public sector. As International Affairs Manager for the city of San Antonio, Texas, he led the programs and initiatives charged with attracting investments and jobs to the region. He has also managed the city's foreign trade offices and municipal representatives in Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City. His private sector experience includes 8 years in banking and business development with global leaders like Merrill Lynch and Citibank. Business Development Director for Latin America and Spain for Global Escape Software, where he managed sales and clients in 35 countries, and VP of Government Affairs for Saber es Poder. So grateful to have you here today. Thank you for all that you do. I'm very excited for you all to hear from one of my absolute favorite authors and fellow El Pasoans, Alfredo Corchado. Thank you for donating your time, energy, and support. So excited to work with you on such a fun program. And now, welcome to Book Club.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you for that kind introduction. And to me, it's also an honor to, participate in a format that lets us interact with the people that have seen these stories, as we say, straight from the horse's mouth. But you mentioned fellow El Pasoan, but I'd like to say that actually Alfredo was born in Durango, just down the street from my hometown as well. And I'm excited that we've learned that we're practically neighbors, but with different paths to the same country here in the US. So this story is just so exciting as well for me as an immigrant. But Alfredo, as you all know, he's an award-winning Mexican-American journalist, and he has covered Mexico for many years. And he was the Mexico City bureau chief for the Dallas Morning News. He specializes in covering the drug wars and the US-Mexico border. He writes stories on topics such as the drug cartels and organized crime, corruption amongst police and government officials, and the spread of drug cartels into US cities, which all of these things have a lot of impact in our daily lives, and also the different things that spill over into commerce and immigration, all those things. He is a graduate of the University of Texas in El Paso. He's reported from cities like Mexico City, Washington, Philadelphia, Cuba, and more. And he's also the author of Midnight in Mexico and Homelands. And he is a native of Durango, Mexico, but proudly calls El Paso home. So to turn it over to Alfredo, I'll just say that my mother is super proud of me that I'm actually getting to introduce him. So that tells you how exciting it is for us to have Alfredo with us. Alfredo, please.
Thank you, Inigo, and it's a great pleasure to be introduced by a Lagunero, a fellow Lagunero, and a fellow El Pasoan. Samantha, thank you so much for all your support, our men, and the World Affairs Council of San Antonio, the book club. It's a real pleasure to speak to Texans and people who really, I guess, who feel and can live the border. Can feel the heartbeat of the border. I just want to talk real quick about what led me to write Homelands. After I wrote Midnight in Mexico was a story of the young boy who leaves Mexico and then goes back. The immigrant with all these idealistic dreams of what Mexico was like, the nostalgia, and then you go back and you experience the good and the bad. At that time, Mexico was really going through the grip of the drug war. I mean, many people will say that's the same story right now. Mexico's still dealing with a lot of the same issues over many years. But in one of the book talks where I was doing about Midnight in Mexico, I ran into some relatives from La Laguna, from the Torreon, Gomez Palacio area, who started kind of peppering me with questions, about what would I write next? And suddenly I thought there's this huge Mexico within the United States. And I started thinking maybe the next book should be about El México de acá, the Mexico within the United States. But how do you write such a book? How do you get away from more of the academic approach? And that's when the idea came about 4 friends who couldn't be more different from one another. You have a restaurant owner, you have a human rights, immigrant rights activist, and you have a lawyer who works for some of the big Fortune 500 companies, and obviously you have the journalist. And I could honestly say that we would not be friends probably in any other setting or city. But I find myself in Philadelphia in January of 1987, incredibly homesick for El Paso. I mean, I've never been away east of the Mississippi. So having the nostalgia at home, facing a winter unlike any other winter, I found what I was told was the only other Mexican living in the Northeast. When I left El Paso, I kept calling friends. I said, ¿a quién más debo llamarme? Who else can I call? Who else can I call in Philadelphia? Do you know anybody? And the name came up of a guy named Primitivo Rodriguez. And Primitivo and I, when we met, it was like, oh my God, I can't believe you're here. Wow, you're human. I can see you. And we started meeting every Saturday at an Indian restaurant. And then suddenly we thought, there's got to be something else. There's got to be something more. Primo had read something about a restaurant in Philadelphia called Tequilas. I went in, we thought, well, what do we have to lose? Let's just check it out. It's probably owned by some big American corporation. I was a young, very young journalist at the Wall Street Journal. I was learning about American enterprise marketing, advertising, et cetera. So I thought these Americans, they're trying to latch on to a growing Hispanic population and the growing popularity of Mexican food. We walked into Tequilas, and the first thing that stands out at me was Pancho Villa. I mean, there was pictures of Pancho Villa, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Zapata, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and music by Miguel Bosé and Mecano. And I thought, these Americans know how to do it. Long story short, I ended up finding 2 other Mexicans. Ken Trujillo, a lawyer from who was still a lawyer. I mean, a student at the University of Pennsylvania, just about to graduate to become a lawyer. and David. And I just want to just read a couple of paragraphs that kind of set the tone for the book and ask what I think is really the fundamental question of the book. So that night, David spoke of his passion for food and how he sought to seduce Americans with Mexican culinary culture and spirits. Soft power, a term that I would later learn. And Ken talked about judicial justice, a vision for a more equal and inclusive country. Primo only hinted at what he was up to, secretly connecting workers on both sides of the border and devising efforts to empower Mexicans in the United States. I told him I just wanted to go back to the border or the Mexico of my childhood, hopefully as a foreign correspondent for a big US newspaper, an illusion that felt more like a pipe dream. That night, we began a conversation that has lasted more than 30 years, turning on a fundamental and deeply personal question. How do we fit in? What does it mean to be an American and become part of its diverse mainstream, integrate into its colorful tapestry, its noble ideas, and timeless democratic principles? Whenever we thought we had figured it out, somehow the entire concept would escape us. We seek the original idea and then we destroy it. The cruel irony of immigration. And looking back over the years, I'm a correspondent for the Morning News. I cover the border, I cover Mexico, and because of the pandemic, I've been really more in El Paso than anywhere else because we're all supposed to be home. But I'll leave it at this. I mean, I've learned throughout my career that I am not complete unless I'm telling stories with the foot in each country. Even though who I am and what I represent, the native and the outsider, is often met with as much rejection in Mexico as it is in the United States. I have spent years trying to shake the feeling that I am hopelessly American in Mexico and Mexican in America. The fatalist, the optimist, always a hopeful immigrant, never fully Mexican, never fully American, often feeling less than one, sometimes more than two, depending on the moment. I think that's really what attracted me to this talk, because when Samantha and I had the initial conversation, I mean, she was talking about her feelings, her I guess, the things she's dealing with. And I thought, my God, it's like a perennial journey. I mean, we're always dealing with that question. And let's take it away, Inigo.
Alfredo, as you mentioned these things, and when I started reading the book, it brought back a lot of memories for me. I'm slightly younger than you, but I grew up in Durango and in Torreon. Then obviously moved to San Antonio, and then I got to live in McAllen. So I got to, in the 90s, hear about when we were going to replace GATT with NAFTA and all the hope that came with it. And then I actually was living in San Antonio when it was signed. And then I would go back and forth, between our towns. I think NAFTA is a great starting point for me to kick off a question to you. I remember going back to Torreon, and my friends were excited about finally being able to work either at Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's, which finally opened up in Mexico thanks to NAFTA back then. And it was seen as a great opportunity to work for an American company. And then the people that had maquilas in Torreon, which, as you know, a lot of manufacturing of clothing for Gap and Levi's is done in Torreon and and in Juarez, they expected a lot of growth, from that. But the results have been, mixed. And I think a lot of promises and hopes were pinned on NAFTA. And I think that's one of the things that is really important for us to, hear from you. What you think, why did these great hopes that were placed on it, some of them materialized and some didn't, and that made the relationship better in some instances, but it made it more difficult in others? Can you comment on a few of those contrasts for us?
It's a fascinating question, because I think that's something that I touched on. I think it was chapter 10, where I talk about the Molotov cocktail. where in 86, 87, you had Ronald Reagan and the amnesty, offering amnesty. More than 1 million, more than 2 million immigrants took part of it, and the majority of them Mexicans. So you had this big sort of a rush or the ground swelling with immigration. Then a few years later, in comes NAFTA. So you have globalization and amnesty kind of happening at the same time. And that was one of the things that really appealed to me about working with, telling the story through these four guys, because we lived through the amnesty period. Mm-hmm. And then we lived through the globalization period. And there was this enormous debate between us as friends. Me from the border thinking, we're, at least the United States, Washington, D.C. and Mexico City will not take into consideration what the border is all about. Because to us, free trade has been a fact of life, forever. I mean, if you want to survive on the border, you have to move goods back and forth. So there was a sense that, yes, this was going to really reshape the two economies. And in many ways it did. But the thing that has never really, taken effect has never really disappeared is the disparity between both countries. And as a reporter, when I go out to the Mexican countryside or provincia, as we call it in Mexico, you're in Guanajuato, you're in Michoacán, you're in San Luis Potosí, you also see the impact of globalization, where they lost millions of jobs. Jobs that basically the American companies kind of came in and took away. You saw, many farmers, thousands of farmers leaving for the United States. But you also, yes, more families have jobs. A lot more families have jobs. But at the end of the day, the wages remain so low.
That's a point that I want to emphasize, which counterintuitively, you had Archer Daniel Midland and Cargill, the giant agro businesses from the United States, benefiting from NAFTA, and you had General Motors and Bombardier, the aerospace companies, moving stuff to Mexico, and I think those were, things that were not expected. And then in Mexico, the disparity of wages, as you mentioned, I think the wage in Mexico is still around $3 a day.
Right.
And here in the United States, we won the $15 an hour as a minimum, and we're neighbors. And these contrasts are so marked that I think it's really important to highlight them as you're mentioning this.
Yeah, you have a place like, for example, Iowa and South Carolina, North Carolina, where suddenly because of amnesty and the militarization of the border or the high security of the border, suddenly people couldn't go back and forth. And then you had all these companies moving south, and you had this need to, this magnet to kind of reconnect, between families themselves. So that in a way is I think what the United States and Mexico have that's been really the debate over the last 30 something years. And we're about to see that again. We're seeing, because of the pandemic, a much greater need for Mexicans to try to come across, because now you're dealing still with the same wages, but also a lot of companies have gone bankrupt or have closed down. So still very much the same issues.
You just mentioned something that also is very important, but a lot of people don't know about it. And the militarization of the border, while it has increased, I think a lot of people don't know about the very close collaboration security-wise that Mexico and the US and Canada have. We had the pleasure of hearing General Jeffrey Buchanan speak to the World Affairs Council about 4 years ago. And he talked about how the Mexican Army and Navy train very closely with the American Northern Command, using the same equipment, same training, same operational things. And a lot of people don't know that has led to a very good security between the countries, but people don't know about that because it's not front and center in newspapers. what people see more is the spillover of the drug war that's going on in Mexico on the streets and the things here. Could you talk a little bit about how the militarization of the border is affecting the people in the ground and how that's different from what we see at the policy level between the countries?
On the ground, the irony is if you talk to border communities, and some people will actually tell you that, yes, there's a lot more security. And if anyone wants to feel and be secure, it's the border residents. I mean, we want to have a sense of security. So when the rest of the country says, we want security, the first ones to say, we need security are border residents. But ironically, if you go to some of these border places, they will tell you there was much more communication among neighbors, among people who live back and forth, who travel back and forth. And because of security, oftentimes that communication broke down. Also, there is a much more cooperation on the military level, on the security level. Federal officials from both sides, and they communicate constantly. As I pointed out in Midnight in Mexico, I mean, the corruption in Mexico also makes this very challenging. Where oftentimes, some of these secrets are being somehow they end up in the hands of drug traffickers. And that's something that, I really went into detail in the previous book. But absolutely, I mean, the communication between both sides, especially on the ground. And there's some cities like, for example, San Diego and Tijuana, where you actually have security agents kind of mingling with one another. And that is, that's really encouraging to see at that level. The last 4 years, obviously, it's a very different chapter in U.S.-Mexico because a lot of it dealt with threats, threats to do this, threats to do that. I guess, the biggest boost we have today along this militarization, if you want to add another layer, is the Mexican National Guard, who in itself has really stepped up to help either the Trump administration or the Biden administration in trying to curtail the migration south to north. So there is much security that's taking place, especially after 9/11, September 11, 2001. And it's something that border residents, are still trying to grapple with the new reality.
You mentioned September 11. Obviously, that's a, before September 11 and after September 11 that everybody, has their finger on. Before September 11, people, and even, further before that, people used to go between Mexico and the United States more often. I remember, when I would drive back to Torreon to go see my grandparents, I'd see the trucks in front of me with the refrigerador and the microondas, and they were packed with all the stuff that they were bringing back to their families. And now, because of the increase in security, that has decreased to the point where people make the decision that because of their documented status, they have decided to not go back and then just send remittances and really decrease the amount of time that they go back to Mexico. Can you talk a little bit about how that has changed the way the Mexican American experience has changed in the United States because of that reduction of that circular flow that was very prevalent in the Bracero program, and then reduced again after September 11, and then with Trump, the threats, everybody thought if I go back, I'm never going to be able to come back in the United States the way this administration is going. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That has really disrupted life as we know it on the border. I'll give you an example. When I come from a family, there were migrant workers, farm workers in California, Central California, before we opened a restaurant in downtown El Paso, just 3 blocks from the International Bridge. But my mother every day, after closing the restaurant, Freddy's Cafe, she would walk outside, cross into Ciudad Juarez, go to the mercado, and buy the tomatoes or jalapenos for the next day. It was that kind of going back and forth. I would go into Juarez to buy the Coca-Cola for the next day. And it was no big deal. It was just a flow. We talk a lot about security. We talk about, what 9/11 has done, what President Trump. But the other big factor that has really disrupted life along the border has been the violence on the Mexican side. There are families very sad in places like El Paso, Laredo, McAllen, Brownsville, Mexican-American families who have not seen their relatives in years because of the fear of long lines, because of, of just how much more military or much more security there is, but also because of the fear of what they read. And I'm as guilty as any journalist, that oftentimes we might spend a little too much time on the narco wars, if you will. And that's something that, ironically, when I became a foreign correspondent, I promised my mom and dad that I would not do so many stories about that, because as they kept telling me, it's demand and it's supply. It's that easy. But it's really not that easy. I mean, when you think about what keeps Mexico from growing, why, the disparity is so huge, you have to also talk about corruption. And I think that became a big, you open your eyes when you're in Mexico and you realize, this is a huge, huge story. But when I see the impact on friends in El Paso and my own relatives who wonder, can I go to Juarez today for a burrito? Can I just go shop? And you feel the fear. Yeah, it makes you think twice, but you also look at the numbers. You keep looking at the numbers, and the numbers, I mean, obviously the numbers don't lie. So it's something that as a journalist, I grapple with. It's someone who was born in Mexico, someone who was raised in the United States. I grapple with that issue a lot.
Well, you mentioned obviously the contrast of corruption between both countries, how that's a big challenge that Mexico has. The rule of law that we have in the United States is one of the reasons we are such a great country. And the fact that in Mexico, contracts can be, annulled if you know the right judge. But right now, even worse, if I can ask for your opinion, when the Mexican government is not following through on contracts that were signed before this administration, like, for example, that large brewery that Constellation was going to build in Mexico, or contracts for renewable energy power purchasing agreements that are not going to be honored for Spanish companies. When the government is now not, making, doing what was agreed upon on those things, that's a new, different level of rule of law being eroded. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Inigo, this is a perfect example where someone like you can give a lot more insight than me as a journalist. I mean, I have to cover the Lopez Obrador administration, but yes, I mean, I think it's clear that a lot of people in the international business community have raised a lot of concerns about really where is Mexico going? What is the role of foreign investment and the role of it's a really key question, as we are about 10 days away from the midterm elections in Mexico. The question of where does Mexico go now? And you see all these changes that are taking place that I would hate as a journalist to give my own personal opinion when this is a government that I have to, cover for at least 3 more years. But I think your question was really full of insight. So I think
well, it's a little bit more recent of some of the things that you hear from people in the business world that are considering international opportunities because they have been there before. But now when you see large multinational corporations that have great law firms behind them and the money from being publicly traded, and despite all of those things, their plans not thrown to the wayside when NAFTA, one of the things that NAFTA did was open up Mexico for those type of opportunities. And now that hesitancy is causing Mexico to not grow economically as much as it did before, and that's going to have a spillover effect, particularly I think along the border. That's the first place that we're going to feel it. So I think it's something that this is an ongoing story that we're going to be feeling the effects of it here in San Antonio for sure, and obviously in El Paso and in other areas.
But let me ask you, how is that going to impact San Antonio?
Well, San Antonio, I've always thought of San Antonio as similar to Los Angeles and Miami, as a gateway to the rest of the United States, as a springboard for people to come and then, you enter the United States business-wise and culturally wise. But also, San Antonio is a springboard for people that want to go to Mexico and do business. And the uncertainty for those of us in the international business community of not being able to answer with any degree of certitude what you can do over there and will it be safe is something that concerns a lot of people in the business sector. And
that is certainly an issue that we hear a lot. I mean, that I hear a lot as a reporter from businesses along the border, energy companies in Texas. Some of the telecommunications companies who are concerned about what happens next. And now, the current issue that we face on the border is the land crossers. I mean, if you're an American and you live in El Paso, you live in San Antonio, you can go to Nuevo Laredo and say, I'm an American, I have to go see my dentist, I have to go, purchase some medicine. The same thing in El Paso. But what happens to the families on the Mexican side who can cross legally as shoppers, to come either visit their relatives or shop? What happens to all these malls in the I-35, along the San Antonio Strip? Because of the pandemic, I mean, it's going on 14 months now that's so many Mexicans, millions of Mexicans, are unable to crisscross the border. And that's a huge story for not just cities like El Paso, but I would say for a city like San Antonio, for a city like Laredo, McAllen, and others who depend so much on the day-to-day, back and forth of merchants going back and forth, shoppers going.
That leads me to one of the questions. So we'd like to take your questions from the audience. Please submit them via the chat, and we'll be, passing them to Alfredo so we can get into them. But what you just mentioned leads me to my first question from the audience, and it says, people aren't going back to Mexico anymore. It seems the Bracero era had families living in the U.S. for seasons and then coming back to Mexico. But now it seems like many Mexicans are no longer going back to Mexico at all. What has this shift done to Mexico, and what has it done to the Americans on the border? Can you comment a bit briefly on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the stories I talk about in the book is about these communities in Guanajuato that I visited. You have one community where people traditionally left for the United States. They went to work, whether it was a Dallas area or beyond, or the Chicago area. But these were people who were traditionally going back and forth. And then obviously in the 90s and in 2000s with security, the crisscrossing stopped. Right next door is another community in the same place in Guanajuato where the migration is really to Canada. And these were, sort of like braceros. These were workers who would go to Canada for about 6 months, 7 months, and then they come home. I mean, it's, they were scheduled visits, but, right before winter here, October, early November, they were back in their communities. And the interesting thing is that as a reporter, I would see these communities, the one going to the United States slowly eroding, slowly dying. Yeah. And the one going back and forth to Canada was thriving. And that's something you see across Mexico these days. Last year, again, because of the pandemic, so many people in my town, which your mother knows, and thank you, your mother, in San Luis de Cordero, Durango, every year people go back for Christmas, for Dia de los Muertos. And last year, I talked to some of my cousins and said, ni una mosca llegó. Yeah. I mean, it was over. And that's the fear for a lot of small communities.
You mentioned that, and I also see how you obviously your experience with reporting on the drug issues during the years of the beginning of the Calderon, crackdown on the cartels, that 2008 to 2013, here in San Antonio and throughout the United States, we had a massive movement of upper class Mexican families because they had been kidnap attempts or whatever, folding up their tents in Mexico and coming to San Antonio, El Paso, Miami, and buying houses cash, which actually helped a lot during the crisis here in San Antonio. Do you feel that that's something that is repeating itself again as upper class families and businesses might want to move into the U.S. since Mexico is a little bit unstable and not going back to Mexico as often?
Yes, I mean, I actually worked on a story about San Antonio, and you can tell me. I mean, I forget the neighborhood in San Antonio. Le dicen Sonterrey.
Monterrey, yes.
Yes, I mean,
Yeah, Sonterra or Son Torreon, because there's people from Torreon here as well.
I mean, but there were these communities in San Antonio, in Austin, and obviously in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with very high-end Mexican migration. I mean, we tend to talk about the low-end migration. The people who come and they work in as gardeners, as maids, as roofers, construction, and so forth. But in the Dallas area, for example, I mean, there was high-level migration, people who come with huge investments that have transformed this whole idea of migration. I mean, and that is at the loss of Mexico. The Dallas-Fort Worth area is a huge community that attracts some of the very high-end migration from throughout Mexico, Monterrey, La Laguna, Mexico City, Querétaro, and that is happening every day. We see that also, obviously, in El Paso, where so many families during the high end of the drug war ended up coming here with their restaurants, with their businesses, and El Paso suddenly had a nightlife. put it to you that way.
Alfredo, the spectrum of migration obviously is wide. Just 2 days ago, I had lunch, actually dinner with a good friend of mine, Antonio Tijerino, who leads the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, and Raúl Lomelí with Saberes Poder. They were basically working with a group that's actually going to McAllen to work with Sister Norma Pimentel and help all the kids that are coming across the border and help, with clothing, tacos, foods, and anything you can do to help. And that other spectrum of the immigrants, which they're not mainly Mexican, a lot of them are Salvadoran, Guatemalan, Nicaraguan, etc., leads me to the question: in your experience or in your reporting, what have you found are some of the effective things that the average person can do to support immigrants in that difficult, transition and helping them be successful in the U.S. without, erasing the stories and identities they bring with them?
It's a very powerful question. I mean,
I need to credit who sent the question. Ambassador Moreno sent that question. I just added a few extra things to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really important question because, I mean, Sister Pimentel, does such a tremendous job. Raúl, Ruben Garcia here in El Paso, Annunciation House. And I don't think we write enough about the people who come from other parts of the U.S., other parts of Texas cities to just come and volunteer. Obviously, yeah, they welcome donations, canned food, etc. But when they show up, I mean, I was in Del Rio a few weeks ago, and I saw volunteers from Washington, D.C., from San Antonio, from Dallas, who were there to lend these places, these NGOs, just a hand to help, the new ones. And I think for many of them, what strikes me is that they keep saying, we're at a time of debating our future as the United States. We can't forget the fact that we're at heart, we're an immigrant nation. Yep. And it's a way to kind of renew that sense of believing what we are and what we've been. And, the question is, will we continue to do that? But I'm always heartened by so much support from other cities or from volunteers from other cities that come down. And if you like, I mean, I can send your group, I can send you, I mean, places here in El Paso that are always looking for volunteers.
That would be great. We really do have World Affairs Council members at heart. They're internationalists, and they know that we're part of a greater world, and we always like learning about those opportunities. So we definitely would like to. We have and I'd like to credit that question was actually from Holly Williams, but we have a question here from Don Luis Moreno, and he mentions he was a U.S. Consul General in Monterrey from 2004 to 2007. So your hometown, Alfredo, was in his consular district and visited often. I'm wondering if it's San Luis Cordero that was his visit often, or Torreon or Gomez Palacio. We're going to credit that as La Laguna.
I want you to know that I did meet Luis Moreno when he was in Monterrey. I mean, that was a hotbed of activity.
So
you're a journalist.
I love the book, obviously. And he's asking if you're wearing the famous blue sports jacket today.
Yes, I am. I very proudly have kept my jacket.
That's awesome. Okay. We have another question here. Let's see. I like this question. This is a great open-ended question. And I think you're the perfect person to answer it. How has the Mexican-American identity evolved since the beginning of this book that you wrote?
That's a really great question. When I started working on Homelands, this was before Donald Trump was an actual candidate. And so, what the president did or didn't do wasn't really impacting what I wrote. But obviously, it really changed the way Americans see Mexicans, etc. And there's always, this constant push to try to redefine, what are we, Mexican Americans, Latinos, Hispanics? I think the latest term now is Latinx. But as I got to the last part of the book, I remember one of the things that really kind of hit me is that no other city really helped me become as Mexican as I am today. It was not because of El Paso. It was not because of Mexico City, but it was really because of Philadelphia. And because there were so many other Mexicans like me who were so nostalgic and were so far away from Mexico, that my friend David Suro, who owns Tequila, basically recreated this little pocket of Mexico. I mean, if you walk into his restaurant, everything in that place is from Guadalajara or from the surrounding Guadalajara area. Everything to his tequila and everything. And then I realized at the end of the book, my God, I am more Mexican than ever because of Philadelphia. And that's something that really kind of surprised me. The first thing I did after I got my vaccine, I got on a flight and I went back to Philadelphia. And I just, I think for every immigrant, that moment is always very different. Yeah. But I mean, it could be many other cities or many other instances. But to me, that was it. And the thing we kind of struggle with throughout the book is how do we develop into the next thing? Yeah. And I remember during the pandemic, David and I kept arguing back and forth, debating back and forth. Are we going to live in Mexico the rest of our lives? Are we going to stay in the United States? And that was the first thing I asked him. What has happened during that pandemic? What has happened over the last couple of years since I wrote the book? And he says, I have too much of a ties in Philadelphia, so that he's more at home, being in between worlds. Yeah. And I think that's why El Paso is it's the longest I've been without Mexico City. But I think in this year, it really kind of underscores the notion, the idea that in a place like El Paso, you really don't have to choose between one place or the other. Yeah. You're again in this world of in-betweens.
It's funny how, with all the different fragmentation of the identity that's happening for Latinx. When I hear Latinx, Um, it's interesting that I think when I grew up in Mexico, I didn't think about my Mexicanness or whatever you would call it, if you will, until I came to the United States, to where people try to assign, you know, labels or sectors to you, and then you realize, you know, that's something that that happens. But
But you
in
know,
San
it's
Antonio,
really interesting to hear you say that because I keep putting myself in your shoes, and you're Lagunero like I am, and I think so many people when they go in between worlds, they really debate the issue a lot. Uh, but the fact that I was raised by very Mexican parents, you know, in my generation, I never stopped speaking the language. I never stopped listening to the music, etc. But as the generations go, I mean, in my family, the younger you are, the less you're likely to speak Spanish, and
yeah,
that's something that I think every generation of Mexican Americans, you know, it's kind of a sense of responsibility to kind of
pass it
keep
on.
our culture and keep the language by sort of, you know, becoming someone like you, Inigo, that, you know, you become a successful person that you can belong to two worlds and kind of set the example that the future of this country, uh, at a place like San Antonio, a place like El Paso, you know, it's a peek into the future. You're bilingual, you're bicultural, and you are binational.
Yeah. You know, the one of the things about San Antonio, and as we mentioned this, San Antonio is such a welcoming city, and it's far away enough from Mexico that it's not a border town, but close enough that you feel at home because there's a lot of people from Mexico and a lot of the flavor, obviously, so much history. But one of the things that comes to mind is that I think people like us, I'd like to say, that are binational, bicultural, really can flourish in a city like this. To me, one of my greatest experiences that I think back on is the president of the university that I graduated from, UTSA. When I graduated, and I got to see him afterwards when I won a scholarship, and I mentioned to him that I was starting the Hispanic employee network for Citibank. He then invited me to a function that he did for university people, that they were hosting the Mexican consul and some academics from south of the border, from the Universidad de Guadalajara and from places like that. And to see at that event, more than anything, all the great people I got to meet, but more than anything, the amount of things that we all have in common, you know, the shared experiences that we all have as immigrants, and those shared experiences of that we came from the countries that we came from, but that in the US you're able to apply some of the things that your very Mexican parents, you know, instilled in you, and you're still able to, you know, grow and be successful. I think that's one of the strengths that, you know, the US really needs to play to more, and for all of us that are, you know, part of this Mexican American experience, to play to that strength. And I think your book really encapsulates that, because the four friends that get together have such a different experience, but yet you all come together to learn from each other, debate and grow, and that's something that is amazing, and it really spoke to me, and I can't wait to have my kids read it too.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a power of food and a power of conversation. And I think more than anything, the book is really about friendship. And
Yes.
it's about a friendship that really doesn't know borders.
Yeah.
And yeah, the fact that, I mean, it's 35 years now as friends, and we're
Yeah.
still together, and we're still, you know, having that same conversation and trying to take it to the new level is an amazing story.
The power of friendship. So that president of university, by the way, that I'm talking about, is Dr. Ricardo Romo, which I'm sure
Yes, I know.
he's written some pretty cool books. And a lot of the people that he introduced me to, you know, Raul Lomelí that I mentioned, and Ambassador Lara, and others have become dear friends, going on, almost 20 years, let's say. But it really is something very powerful about your book, how you frame this Mexican American experience, the ties between two countries, in tequila and friends on a table, learning from each other's experience. It's wonderful. And I want to thank you again for taking the time to share your experience and your knowledge with us today. I think our members are very pleased having the opportunity as well. I'd like to turn it over and be mindful of the time that people are sharing with us today, and turn it over to Samantha for closing remarks.
Inigo, thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you guys. And thank you everyone who asked questions, participated, gave your thoughts. We had a message from Ricardo Romo who said he was presente. So happy to have you guys. I just want to thank everyone for your time and participation. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, your support. And we look forward to our, unofficial June book club. We'll be talking about books featuring border crossings. So, it's a similar theme, but, even more branched out and even more borders. There's a huge world out there, and there's a lot of different experiences. And also keep an eye out for our event on Iran, upcoming elections and U.S. diplomacy on June 9th. And if you want to continue supporting the World Affairs Council of San Antonio, see more programs like this, please consider a membership or consider donating. We just really appreciate your love and support, and so happy to have you guys here. I have some of my family members here, so excited that they were able to come visit.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and everyone. Hope to meet in person soon.
Absolutely. And I got El Paso in the background, so I'm always representing.
Love that shot.
In person
Well,
with some tequilas, right, Alfredo?
Right.
Yes.
But I'm going to call you, Inigo, about the elections.
Oh, for sure.
Thank you.
For sure, looking forward to it.
And be sure to look at Alfredo's articles as they're coming out. He's covering the Mexican midterms, so that'll be a big one.
I'm up to Chihuahua.
Nice.
Thank you guys, and have a great day. Thanks all for tuning in.